She stood on that platform knowing four prettier women had already walked away. She looked at the man who needed help, the children who needed saving, and she said the one thing no woman had ever said to him before. She told him the truth, and then a 3-year-old girl made the decision for all of them. This is the story of Clara Whitfield, the woman nobody wanted and the family that changed everything. The letter had promised a home. It had not promised this. Clara Whitfield stood on the platform of Bear Creek Station with a carpet bag in one hand and $14 folded into the lining of her left boot because that was where her mother had told her to keep whatever mattered most. The October wind came off the mountains like a living thing pressing through the wool of her navy traveling dress, finding every seam that had been mended one too many times. She had been on the train for 3 days. She had eaten twice. She had slept in the kind of broken intervals that left a person more tired than if she had not tried at all. The station itself was barely a station. A timber platform, a hand-painted sign that had weathered 2 winters and was losing the argument. Bear Creek, it still said, though the B was fading and the C was gone entirely. Beyond the platform, the land opened into a valley so wide and so steeped in autumn color that Clara forgot for a moment to breathe. The aspens had turned. They covered the lower slopes of the mountains in a wash of gold, so deep it looked like something burning, rather than something dying. And the sky above the peaks was that particular shade of blue that only exists at altitudes so clean and cold, it almost hurt to look at it directly. She had $14, a bag that weighed less than she wished it did, and a folded piece of paper she had torn from a church bulletin board 11 days ago. She did not look in the paper again. She had memorized it the first night lying on the narrow bed in Margaret Holt's boarding house with the wind pressing at the single window, reading the words over and over until they stopped being words and started being something closer to a rope thrown down into a hole she had been standing in for 2 years. Widower, 3 children, need help, send word. And beneath that, in smaller letters added by a different hand, or perhaps added later by the same hand in a different state of mind. Hard conditions, mountain winter, not for the faint of heart. She had not known when she tore the notice from the board whether that last line was a warning meant to discourage her or a confession meant to explain. She still did not know. But she had sent the telegram anyway, and she had bought the train ticket with 11 of her remaining dollars, and now here she was standing on a platform at the edge of what felt like the end of the known world, watching 4 young women she had never met laugh together near the far end of the railing. The women were pretty in the way that comes easily to those who have never been told otherwise. Well-dressed, confident in the particular manner of people who expect to be chosen. Clara watched them from beneath the brim of her hat and said nothing, and did not introduce herself because she could hear what they were saying, and she understood from the way they were saying it that she was not meant to be part of that conversation. A widower with 3 children, the one with fair hair was saying. At least there is no mother-in-law to deal with. Do you think the children are well behaved? Said another. Does it matter if the wages are acceptable? The children become manageable. If the wages are insulting, no amount of angelic behavior makes it worth it. They laughed. It was easy laughter, the kind that does not cost anything. Clara looked away from them and looked instead toward the far end of the platform, where a wagon stood with 2 draft horses that had the patient 1,000-yard expression of animals who had made this trip more times than they could be bothered to count. Near the wagon stood 3 men. She had expected 1. The 3 of them stood in a loose line without quite seeming to have arranged themselves that way, and even from a distance, even in the gray and gold light of that October afternoon, they were the kind of men who occupied space differently than other people. Not because they were large, though they were, each of them tall enough, that the platform seemed scaled to fit them, rather than the other way around. It was something else, something in the way they held themselves. Like men who had learned through years of weather and labor and isolation that the world did not particularly care whether they were comfortable, and who had made their peace with that understanding in a way that gave them a stillness most men never find. The one in the middle stood slightly forward of the other 2. He had the look of a man in his middle 30s who had been older than that for a long time. Dark hair going to gray at the temples, a jaw set like a cornerstone. His hat was pushed back just enough that she could see his eyes, and even across the distance, she could tell they were the color of good whiskey, held up to firelight, amber and deep, and carrying something in them that she did not yet have a name for. To his right stood a man who was watching everything and saying nothing. He had the watchful quality of someone who had decided long ago that the world made more sense if you let it talk first. His hands were in his coat pockets, and his expression was composed in the deliberate way that takes more effort than it looks. To the left stood a younger man who was not making any particular effort to look composed. He stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt and his weight shifted to one leg, and the expression of someone who found most situations at least mildly interesting. There was a warmth to him that read from across the platform like a banked fire, steady and real. Behind the man in the middle, barely visible, were three children. Clara saw them almost last, which she would think about later. The girl was the oldest, 8 years old perhaps, with dark hair pulled back in a braid that had come half undone, and a face that was very still in the way that children's faces are still when they have taught themselves not to show what they are feeling. She had her arms crossed against her chest. She was watching the pretty women at the other end of the platform with the expression of someone watching weather coming in from the north. She had seen this before. She knew how it ended. The boy beside her was younger by a few years. He was holding his sister's hand. He was not watching the women. He was looking at his boots. And then there was the small one, the youngest 3 years old or thereabouts, pressed against the back of the man's leg, with both arms wrapped around it as though the leg were a tree and there was a storm coming. Her face was turned into the fabric of his trousers. She was not crying, she was simply holding on. Something moved in Clara's chest. She had felt it before that particular movement, but she had not felt it in a long time. And it surprised her the way things surprise you when you have forgotten they are still possible. It was not pity exactly. It was closer to recognition. The feeling of seeing something in another person that you have been carrying in yourself for so long that you have stopped noticing the weight of it. She stood there for another moment with the wind in her hair and $14 in her boot and 2 years of a particular kind of silence behind her, and she thought about Philadelphia. She always thought about Philadelphia when she needed to remind herself what was at stake. She had been 21 years old when she had answered the advertisement in the Philadelphia Inquirer. She was not proud of it, though she had long since stopped being ashamed of it, either because shame requires a belief that you could have chosen differently, and looking back at the woman she had been at 21, sitting alone in the room above her mother's sewing shop 3 months after her mother's burial, she could not honestly say that different choices had been available to her. The advertisement had been straightforward. Gentleman farmer, Kansas, seeks respectable wife. Will provide home and security. References exchanged. Reply promptly. She had replied promptly. His name was Harold Price, and in his letters, he had seemed like a reasonable man. Measured. Practical. He spoke of his farm in terms that suggested competence. He asked about her skills without being unpleasant about it. He did not mention love, which Clara respected, because she had read enough failed promises to know that the word was often the cheapest thing on offer. She had packed her mother's good candlestick, her own small collection of books, and a dress she had made herself from gray wool that she believed suited her well. She had taken the train from Philadelphia to Abilene in the late spring of 1872, watching the landscape unspool from city to plains like a cloth being unrolled, and she had arrived at the Abilene station with a heart that was not precisely hopeful, but was at least for the first time since her mother's death pointing in a direction. Harold Price was standing on the platform when she stepped off the train. He looked at her for a long time, long enough that the people nearby noticed and looked away out of secondhand discomfort. Then he said in a voice that carried further than he perhaps intended, "I ordered a grown woman, not a child. You are not what I asked for. You are not suitable." He said it the way you say a sentence that is simply factual. There was no cruelty in his tone, which somehow made it worse than cruelty would have been. He was simply reporting what he saw. Then he walked back into the station without picking up her bag. Clara stood on the platform in Abilene, Kansas in her gray wool dress with her mother's candlestick in her bag and her heart in a place it had never been before, and she waited until the people around her had found other things to look at. Then she picked up her bag and went to find the station master to ask about the next train east. She did not have enough money for a ticket back to Philadelphia. She had enough for a ticket as far as Helena, Montana, where a woman she had once corresponded with through her mother's church had mentioned there might be work. She had worked in Margaret Holt's boarding house for 2 years. She had been in most of the ways that counted very good at it. And she had told herself, in the way that people tell themselves things that are necessary rather than true, that she had made peace with what Harold Price had said on that platform, that she had set it down, that it no longer lived in her the way that it had. But the truth was that it lived there still, not loudly, not always, but it was there the way a mended crack in a wall is there, invisible until the light falls at a certain angle, and then unmistakable and impossible to forget. She was not suitable. She had heard it enough in enough different configurations that she had begun to suspect it was simply the shape of the truth about her. The boarding house had suited her well enough in the way that sufficient things suit people who have stopped expecting more than sufficient. Margaret Holt was a strict woman and a fair one, which is not the same as a kind one, but is sometimes more useful. She had given Clara a room that was small, but private, work that was demanding but straightforward, and wages that were modest but reliable. Under different circumstances, Clara might have stayed another year without too much difficulty. But the circumstances had changed. Margaret had called her into the small office off the kitchen on a Tuesday evening in late September, and she had said what she said with the same businesslike directness she brought to everything else. The boarding house was being sold. The new owners were family. There was no position available. And then, because Margaret Holt was a woman who believed that unpleasant truths were kinder in the long run than comfortable silences, she had said the rest of it. "You are 23 years old, Clara. A woman your age with your circumstances ought to have found her footing by now. I do not say this to wound you. I say it because I think you need to hear it from someone who means you no harm. You are quiet when you should speak. You make yourself smaller than you are. You have convinced yourself somehow that you are less than your work proves you to be. A man will not choose a woman who has already decided she is not worth choosing." Clara had thanked her and gone back to the kitchen and finished washing the supper dishes. That night she had walked to the Baptist church 3 streets over because she could not sleep, and because walking was the only thing that helped when her mind would not quiet. The bulletin board outside the church held the usual assortment of community notices. Lost animals, church socials, a used plow for sale, and one notice smaller than the rest tacked at the lower corner with a single nail that made it flutter in the wind like something trying to get free. She had read it 3 times standing on the street in the dark with the wind off the mountains pushing at her back. Then she had taken it down. She had sent the telegram the following morning. She had purchased a train ticket that afternoon with 11 of her remaining $14. She had packed her bag that evening, set her alarm for 4 in the morning, and spent the hours between lying on her narrow bed in the dark, with her hands folded on her stomach, looking at the ceiling and thinking about the small line at the bottom of the notice. Not for the faint of heart. She was not certain she was not faint of heart. She had some evidence that she was. But she had also spent 2 years being sufficient, and she was beginning to understand that sufficient was a kind of slow disappearing, and she thought that disappearing slowly was perhaps the thing she was most afraid of, or more afraid of than mountains or winter or any man's judgment. So she went. The 4 women had finished their assessment of the situation and were now approaching the 3 men at the wagon end of the platform with the confidence of people who believe the outcome is already settled. Clara stayed where she was and watched. The fair-haired woman reached the man in the middle first. "Mr. Calloway," she said with a brightness that had been calibrated carefully, "I am Miss Everdeen Foster. I wrote in response to your notice." "Miss Foster." His voice was low and even. "Thank you for coming." "Of course, the journey was rather long, but we managed." She glanced at the other women as though they were a traveling party she had organized. "What would the wages be, Mr. Calloway?" "Room and board, $8 a month." There was a beat of silence. $8, Miss Foster said, "for 3 children." "Yes, ma'am." "I would need 20 at minimum, and a room with a lock on the inside and Sundays free." The man on the left, the younger one, made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was related to one. The man on the right said nothing. The man in the middle, Calloway, looked at Miss Foster with an expression that had long since moved past disappointment and arrived somewhere in the territory of people who have stopped being surprised. "I understand," he said. He did not counter-offer. He simply understood. The second woman said that she would require a clothing allowance as the work would ruin her dresses. The third woman inquired whether the children were well behaved in a tone that made clear she hoped they were not, because that would give her a reason she could state openly. The fourth woman looked at all 3 of the Calloway men for a long moment and then turned to the woman beside her and said something quietly that made them both look away from the children. It took 11 minutes. Clara counted without meaning to. Then all 4 of them turned and walked back toward the station building, and their voices came back on the wind, already moved on to other topics. Calloway stood where he had been standing. He had not moved. The children had not moved either. The girl with the undone braid was looking at the ground now. The boy was still holding his sister's hand. The small one was still pressed against her father's leg. Clara set down her carpet bag and picked it back up. She walked to the end of the platform. She was aware as she walked that one of the departing women turned and saw her and said something to the others. She did not look at them. She kept her eyes on the man in the middle and kept walking until she was close enough that stopping felt less like a choice and more like what happened next. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I am Clara Whitfield. I sent you a telegram." He looked at her. It was the kind of looking that she had learned to brace for the slow inventory that men performed when the subject was a woman they were deciding about. She had been looked at that way on a train platform in Kansas once before, and she knew what it felt like when the looking ended in a particular kind of verdict. She waited. The woman behind her made a sound. "You think he wants you look at yourself." The words were not new. They were in fact so familiar that for a moment they simply registered as noise rather than meaning the way a sound you hear every day ceases to be remarkable. But then they settled and the old weight came with them, the particular heaviness that lives just below the sternum and makes breathing feel like something that requires more effort than it should. Clara looked at Elias Calloway and did not look away. She said the thing she had been told was her most fundamental truth. The thing that had been said to her and about her and around her often enough that she had stitched it into the lining of how she understood herself, and she said it out loud in a voice that shook slightly and did not stop. "I know I am not what anyone would choose. I have known that for some time. I am not here to pretend otherwise." She paused, and then she did what she had not entirely planned to do, which was to look past Elias Calloway's shoulder at the 3 children standing behind him, at the girl whose braid had come undone and who was looking at the ground because she already knew how this ended, at the boy who was holding his sister's hand, at the small one who had turned her face out from her father's leg and was looking at Clara with the wide-eyed, unguarded eyes of a child who has not yet learned to be careful with her looking. "But I can love your children," Clara said. "I have enough in me for that, and I will not leave." The platform went quiet in the particular way that outdoor spaces go quiet when the wind shifts. Elias Calloway looked at her for another moment. His expression had not changed, but something in it had moved the way a thing moves underwater when you can see the ripple on the surface but not the thing itself. He opened his mouth to say something. He did not say it. Because the small girl Millie, 3 years old and unbothered by the conventions of adult deliberation, pulled her arms from around her father's leg and walked forward on her small legs and reached up with both hands and stood there in front of Clara with her arms raised. The gesture was not ambiguous. Clara set down her bag. She bent and she gathered the child up and Millie Calloway put her face into the curve of Clara's neck and made a sound that was not quite crying and not quite sighing, but was somewhere between the two. The sound of something that has been held tightly for a very long time, beginning at last to release. Nobody spoke. The woman behind Clara said something under her breath, and the footsteps on the platform boards went away and did not come back. Elias Calloway bent and picked up Clara's carpet bag. "It's an hour's ride to the ranch," he said. "The children have not eaten since this morning." He turned and walked toward the wagon. Clara followed him with Millie still in her arms, and the child's small hands pressed against the back of her neck. And the mountain wind moving through the aspens on the lower slopes, and everything she owned in the bag that a stranger was carrying for her for the first time in 2 years without being asked. The man on the right was Cormac. She learned this on the wagon when Levi, who was the younger one, introduced himself with the ease of someone who had never found introductions difficult. "I am Levi," he said. "That is Cormac." He nodded toward the man who had said nothing. "And you have already met Elias, which is to say you have been looked at by him and found not immediately objectionable, which is the closest thing to a warm welcome Elias has offered anyone in recent memory." "Levi," said Elias from the front of the wagon without turning around. "I am being accurate," said Levi. Cormac said nothing. He was sitting on the opposite side of the wagon bed from Clara with Della, the 8-year-old, beside him, and he was looking at the road ahead with the expression of a man conducting a private assessment that he had not yet finished and was not prepared to share. His hands were on his knees. The knuckles were scarred in the small, specific way that comes from years of work rather than years of fighting ropes and timber and cold and the accumulated argument with a hard landscape. Clara looked at him steadily until he looked back. When he did, she held his gaze for a moment and then looked away, not in retreat, but in the simple acknowledgement that she had seen him and he had seen her, and there was no particular reason to make more of it than that. "How far are we from town?" she asked. 12 miles, said Levi, though in winter it might as well be 100. "Levi," said Elias. "She asked," said Levi simply. Cormac still said nothing, but Clara noticed in the way that she had always noticed things at the edges of conversations that he had shifted fractionally in his seat so that Della was a little more sheltered from the wind. She filed that away. The valley opened before them as the road climbed, and Clara watched it through the cold, clear air with the particular attention of someone who is trying to understand a thing they may be responsible for. The mountains on the north face were already holding snow on their upper shoulders. The creek that ran along the road had the look of water that was thinking about ice. The aspens were beautiful, and they were letting go of their leaves in steady, indifferent falls that the wind caught and carried sideways before setting them down in the yellow-carpeted meadows below. Henry the boy was sitting beside her. He had not said anything. He was looking at the mountains with the focused, cataloging expression of a small scientist taking inventory of his world. At one point, he shifted slightly, and his shoulder came to rest against Clara's arm, and he did not acknowledge this having happened, and she did not either. She simply stayed where she was and let the warmth of it be unremarkable. The taller peaks caught the last of the afternoon sun as they rounded the final ridge, and then the Calloway Ranch came into view below them. It was not what failure looked like. She wanted to be accurate about that. It was a substantial property, a good barn, a solid house built to last corrals that had been thoughtfully placed relative to the prevailing wind. Someone had once put real care into the design of this place. Someone had understood the land and worked with it rather than against it. But that someone had been absent for some months now, and the land had been quietly reclaiming what it could. The kitchen garden had gone to seed. The fence line along the eastern pasture had 3 rails down. The porch held a pile of laundry that had been there long enough that it had flattened under its own weight. The water trough needed skimming. "It needs work," Elias said from the front of the wagon. He had heard something in her silence, or he had simply anticipated the looking and was getting ahead of it. "Yes," Claire said. "I have been occupied with other things." "I can see that." There was a beat. Then she said, "It is not ruin. It is grief that has been allowed to sit and accumulate. Those are not the same thing." She did not know why she said it. It was not a diplomatic thing to say, and she was not generally an undiplomatic person. But it was true, and it seemed to her that truth was likely more useful here than diplomacy, and she had spent enough of her life saying the safe thing to know that it rarely helped anyone. Elias said nothing, but the line of his shoulders changed slightly in a way she noticed and did not yet know what to do with. The room they showed to her was small and spare and clean, in the honest way of rooms that have not been occupied recently enough to gather the complicated clutter of living. There was a bed with a quilt, a washstand with a basin, a hook behind the door, a window that looked out on the yard, and beyond the yard the first long slope of the mountain. Elias stood in the doorway and said, "There is a lock on the inside." He said it the way he seemed to say most things, directly and without decoration. It was not a ceremonial reassurance. It was information. "Thank you," Clara said. She set her carpet bag on the bed and looked at the room and thought with a clarity that surprised her that it was the best room she had been given since her mother's house, and that she did not intend to leave it. Della was standing in the hallway. Clara had not heard her approach. When she turned and saw her, the girl did not pretend she had not been watching. She had her arms crossed again, and her chin lifted, and her expression had the particular composure of a child who has made herself the author of her own dignity, because the world has given her insufficient alternative. "You will not stay," Della said. It was not a question. "I intend to." That is what the others said, all 5 of them. Clara considered this for a moment. Then she said, "How many have there been since your mother?" "5 women in 4 months. Della said it with the precision of someone who has kept count, because keeping count is the only form of control available to her. Clara sat down on the edge of the bed. "I will not ask you to trust me," she said. "That would not be fair under the circumstances. But I would like to ask you for something smaller than trust. I would like to ask you to let me try." Della looked at her. The silence stretched out. Then the girl turned and walked back down the hallway without answering. Clara did not interpret this as a refusal. She interpreted it as the only honest response available to an 8-year-old who has learned through repeated and specific experience that hope is a thing that costs you something every time it does not pay off. She sat with that for a moment. Then she stood up, rolled up her sleeves, and went to find the kitchen. The kitchen was its own kind of archaeology, dishes stacked in the order they had been given up on rather than the order that made sense, pots clean but not put away, a half-written grocery list on the windowsill that had been started and abandoned and started again in different handwriting on 3 separate occasions, as though 3 different people had each concluded separately that the task was more than they currently had the capacity for. A child's drawing tacked to the wall beside the stove, a house and 4 figures, one of them much smaller than the others, made with the earnest inaccuracy of a hand that is still learning what it means to put a thing down on paper and have it be true. Clara looked at all of it without judgment. She put water on to boil. She found the flour and the lard and the salt. She found what vegetables were still good in the coal box and what dried beans were in the pantry and what stock remained from the last time someone had made stock, which from the appearance of things had been 3 weeks ago. She built a soup that was not complicated and did not need to be, because what the evening needed was not complexity, but warmth. Something that smelled like the kitchen was inhabited and functioning and expected to go on. She was halfway through the dishes when she heard the back door open. Elias came in from the barn with the look of a man who has spent the last hour doing something he did not need to do because he needed to do something. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the clean counters and the sleeping children and the soup simmering on the stove and the dishes stacked and drying in the rack. "You did not need to do all of this," he said. "I know. I hired you for the children. I needed to work." She dried her hands on the towel. "It is the only reliable way I have found to stop my mind from running in circles." He was quiet for a moment. Then he went to the shelf and took down the coffee tin and filled the pot and put it on the back of the stove. When it had done what it needed to do, He poured 2 cups and set one on the counter beside her without asking whether she wanted it. She wrapped both hands around it. They stood in the kitchen in the lamplight, with the coffee between them and the wind in the eaves and Millie sleeping on the cot near the hearth, one small fist curled under her chin. Her name was Marin, Elias said. He said it without warning and without prologue, the way people say things that they have been carrying for long enough that the carrying has become more difficult than the saying. Clara did not respond immediately. She let the name settle in the room and take up the space it deserved. She planted violet on the south slope, he said. Every spring, said it was the only color that came back reliably, that you could count on it. She was right about that, Clara said. Violet is stubborn. It comes back no matter what. Elias looked at his coffee. The children have not heard me say her name, he said. Not since the burial. They need to. He looked up. They need to hear you say it, Clara said quietly, so that they know it is allowed, so that they know the memory of her is not something that has to be kept hidden to keep you standing. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. He did not answer. He drank his coffee and set the cup in the rack and said goodnight in his even, uninflected way and went to bed. But Clara stood at the kitchen window for a long time after looking out at the dark bulk of the mountain against the stars, and she thought about what Levi had said on the wagon. 5 women, 4 months. None of them had stayed. And she thought about Cormac in the hallway that she had passed on her way to bed, sitting in the chair at the far end with a piece of wood in his hands that he was shaping with a small knife, not looking at her, but aware of her the way animals in the wild are aware of things they have not yet decided about. She had felt his eyes on her back. She had kept walking. In her room, she took out the small journal she had carried since Philadelphia and wrote 4 sentences, which was all she had the energy for. Day 1 at Callaway Ranch, 3 children, 3 men, and a mountain that does not care whether I stay or go. She capped the pen. She lay down on the bed with the quilt pulled to her chin and the window dark against the dark sky outside, and she thought about the $14 still in her boot and the ticket she no longer had, and the woman on the platform who had said, "Look at yourself." She thought about Millie's hands pressed against the back of her neck. She thought about Della in the hallway. "You will not stay." She thought about Elias, who had said her name like it cost him something he could not spare. She thought, "I will stay long enough to matter, and then I will stay past that." And then for the first time and longer than she could honestly account for, she slept without the particular anxiety that comes from knowing that the morning will require you to explain yourself to someone who has not yet decided whether you are worth the trouble. She slept as though she had, against all reasonable expectation, arrived somewhere. Outside, the wind moved through the aspens on the lower slope. Somewhere in the house, one of the children turned in sleep and did not cry out. The mountain stood where it had always stood, large and indifferent, impermanent, and under the stars of Bear Creek Valley. The first night of a new life went by the way all first nights go, quietly and entirely without ceremony, but not entirely without promise. The second morning at Callaway Ranch, Clara was awake before the house. She had learned this about herself in the 2 years at Margaret Holt's boarding house, that her body did not trust silence the way other people's bodies did, that it interpreted quiet as something requiring investigation rather than something permitting rest. She was at the kitchen stove before 4 o'clock, building the fire from the coals she had banked the night before, listening to the particular quality of the darkness outside, which was different from the darkness she had known in Helena. Deeper, more complete, the kind of darkness that did not apologize for itself. She had the water on, and the porridge started before she heard the small sound at the kitchen door. Della was standing there in her nightgown with her hair loose around her shoulders and her feet bare on the cold floorboards. She was not looking at Clara. She was looking at the stove with the focused, possessive expression of someone who has arrived to find another person in their seat. Clara said nothing. She moved to the left side of the stove and gave the right side its own space and continued stirring the porridge. After a moment, Della came fully into the kitchen. She did not help. She stood at the right edge of the stove with her arms crossed and her chin at the angle Clara was beginning to recognize as her resting position, which was to say the position from which she conducted all assessments before she had decided whether to be guarded or merely watchful. "You are making it too thick," Della said. "Am I? Henry does not like it thick. He will not eat it if it is thick." Clara adjusted the proportion of water. "Like this." Della looked at the pot. "Add a little more." Clara added a little more. They stood in the kitchen together in the pre-dawn dark, older girl directing and the grown woman adjusting, and neither of them commented on the arrangement, because commenting on it would have required acknowledging that it was in some way unusual, and neither of them was yet prepared to do that. "Does he like it sweetened?" Clara asked. "Maple if we have it, honey if we do not." "Where is the maple?" Della reached past her to the second shelf of the pantry and took down the small tin without hesitation. She had the exact and intimate knowledge of her own kitchen that comes not from being taught but from having been necessary, and Clara recognized it immediately because she had once had the same knowledge of her mother's kitchen had been the one who knew where things were, because being the one who knew was the only reliable form of usefulness available when everything else was uncertain. She did not say any of this. She took the maple tin and added the right amount and said thank you. Della put her arms back across her chest and looked at the pot. "He also will not eat it if there is a skin on top," she said. "Then we will make sure there is no skin." They made sure there was no skin. The days found their shape gradually the way rivers find their channels, not all at once, but through the accumulated pressure of small, daily decisions that eventually become routine. Clara was careful not to rush it. She had some instinct, not articulated, but present, that the Calloway house was a place that would resist being organized from the outside, that its rhythms were its own and needed to be understood before they could be worked with rather than against. So she watched. She watched the way Elias moved through the morning, which was quietly and with the deliberate efficiency of a man who had learned to move through his own house as though he were aghast in it. He did not linger. He appeared he ate what was put in front of him. He thanked her in the specific minimal way that suggested the thanks was genuine, but the elaboration was beyond his current capacity, and then he went outside to the work that the ranch required of him. She watched the way Cormac worked, which was differently from Elias in ways she was still cataloging, where Elias moved through the house as though it pained him to be in it. Cormac moved through it as though he were performing a kind of vigil. She would find him in the evenings at the table with a piece of wood and a small knife, working at something she could not yet make out, and he would look up when she came in and look back down without particular urgency in either direction. She was beginning to understand a man who had decided very early in his life that the world made more sense if you let it arrive rather than going out to meet it. And he applied this principle with a consistency that looked like coldness until you understood it was actually something closer to patience. He left firewood by the kitchen door every morning. He did not tell her this would happen. He simply did it, and she found it there, and she understood that this was the form his acknowledgement took, that he was not a man who communicated in words when action was available. She watched the way Levi moved through the house, which was with the easy, unguarded quality of someone who had made peace with himself and found the terms acceptable. He was the one who talked to the children, who could make Henry's concentrated expression break into something resembling a smile, who could sit beside Millie when she woke crying in the night and tell her something in a low voice that Clara could not hear from her room, but that seemed from the quiet that followed to be exactly the right thing. He was also, she noticed, watching her. Not in the way that Cormac watched, which was careful and ongoing and made no particular effort to be subtle. Levi watched her the way he watched everything, with a warmth in it that did not judge but wanted to understand. On the fourth evening he said, "Where did you come from before Helena?" "Philadelphia." "Long way." "Yes." "Family there?" "My mother, she died 3 years ago." He nodded slowly in the way of someone adding a piece to a picture they have been building for some time. "And you came west because east had nothing left to offer." He looked at her steadily. "That is a careful way of saying something. It is the accurate way." He did not push further, but she could see him turning it over, setting it somewhere he could return to. Levi Calloway she was coming to understand a man who collected things, not objects, but understandings, small known facts about the people around him that he held gently and did not misuse. She did not yet know what he would do with what he was collecting about her. The second week brought the first frost. Clara woke to it before anyone else and stood at her window and looked at the meadow below the house, which had gone silver overnight, in the way of things that have been waiting for the cold to tell them what they truly are. The mountains were clear and sharp against a sky the color of flint, and the creek along the lower pasture had begun to slow at its edges, the water thickening at the margins into the first uncertain suggestions of ice. She thought, this is the world that shaped these men, and then she thought, this is the world I have to be shaped by now. She went to the kitchen and built the fire and started breakfast and did not think about Helena or Philadelphia or the particular quality of warmth that comes from a room you have lived in long enough to stop noticing its details. Henry came to find her after breakfast. He did not ask permission. He simply appeared at the garden gate where she was turning the soil around, what remained of the autumn planting, and he stood there with his hands in his coat pockets and his serious face pointed at the work she was doing. "What are you planting?" he asked. "Not planting, turning. You turn the soil in autumn so that it is ready for spring. You give it time to rest and settle and know what it is before you ask it to grow something." Henry thought about this with the concentrated regard he brought to all information. How long does it take? All winter. That is a long time to rest. Everything that needs to do something important in spring has to rest at all winters first, she said. Trees do it. Animals do it. Soil does it. Do people do it? She looked at him. He was 5 years old and he was asking her a question that men twice his age spent lifetimes avoiding. Some people, she said, the ones who figure out that they need to. He considered this. Then he crouched down beside her and picked up a stick and began to turn soil with it inexpertly, but with the deep seriousness of someone who has decided to understand something from the inside. They worked together until the cold made Clara's hands ache, and neither of them felt the need to say anything further about resting or growing or the long patience of winter. She found the room by accident. She had been looking for the linen cupboard, which Levi had told her was at the end of the upstairs hall, and she had opened the wrong door and stepped into a room that knew immediately it was not for her. It was not a large room, but it was complete in a way that the rest of the house was not complete in the specific way of rooms that have been inhabited by a particular personality so thoroughly that the personality remains even after the person is gone. A woman's dresses hung from hooks along the far wall. Not many, 3 or 4 of the good dress and the work dress and the in-between dress of a woman who had not had occasion for more, but had kept what she had with care. A small mirror above a washstand with a brush and comb laid parallel in the way of someone who believes in small exactitudes. A book left open on the bedside table with a strip of blue ribbon marking the page where she had stopped, as though she had meant to return. And on the windowsill in a small clear glass jar, a dried arrangement of violet. The flowers had kept their color better than might have been expected, still faintly purple in the October light, as though they had decided to hold on. Clara stood in the doorway and understood with the specific understanding that comes from seeing rather than being told what Elias Calloway had lost. She heard his step in the hall before she could move. He stopped behind her. She turned. His face had not changed in any way that could be precisely described, but something behind it had some steadying mechanism that had been in place and was now working harder. "I opened the wrong door," she said. "I am sorry." "It is all right." He did not move to close the door. He stood in the hall and looked past her into the room with the expression of a man looking at something he both cannot leave alone and cannot bear to approach. "She planted violet on the south slope," Clara said carefully. "You told me that." "Yes." She looked at the dry jar on the windowsill, at the small, stubborn purple that had decided to outlast the season it belonged to. "Something that returns every year without being asked has already decided where it belongs," she said. His eyes came back to her face. "I have not been in it," he said. Since May. She did not say anything. I know I should. The children have asked. Della has asked twice. He stopped. I do not know how to go in there and come back out again. Clara thought about this honestly. Then she said, perhaps you do not have to come back out the same way you went in. The silence after that was long and had texture. He reached past her and pulled the door closed gently with the care of someone closing something that is not finished but needs to rest for now. He said goodnight. He walked back down the hall. Clara went to find the linen cupboard, which was exactly where Levi had said it was, and she stood in front of it for a moment with her hand on the folded sheets before she realized her eyes had filled and she was not entirely sure when that had happened. The next morning, the dried violet was gone from the windowsill, and on the kitchen table in a small jar she had not put, there was a cluster of the last wild violet from the south slope cut before the frost, their purple, small and stubborn, and astonishing in the gray morning light. Nobody mentioned it. Nobody needed to. She heard Cormac and Levi in the barn on the sixth night. She had gone to fill the water bucket from the outside pump before bed because the inside line had frozen at the joint where it met the outer wall, which was one of a number of things that needed attention before the deep cold arrived and turned inconvenience into genuine difficulty. The barn door was not fully latched, and the voices came through the gap with the particular clarity of cold air which carries sound the way warm air does not. She was not trying to listen. She stopped because she heard her own name. She will not last through winter, Cormac said. None of them have. That is not the same as saying she will not. Levi's voice quieter but present. 5 women in 4 months, Levi. Elias cannot keep putting the children through this. Millie is already attached. You have seen it. I have seen it. I do not think it is the problem you think it is. If she leaves in January, Millie will not understand why. She is 3 years old. She will only know that another person who held her went away. A pause. The horses shifted in their stalls. The wind moved through the boards of the barn wall. Then she needs to not leave in January, Levi said. That is not something we control. Perhaps it is something we affect. Another pause, longer this time. She is different, Levi said. Then, as though aware that this required defense, the others had conditions, requirements, things they would and would not do. She came with nothing and asked for nothing except to try. That is not the same kind of person. It is too early to know what kind of person she is. I know what kind of person goes to a platform in October and says what she said. You were standing there, Cormac. You heard her. The silence that followed had a different quality from the ones before it. Clara thought she heard the sound of a knife blade moving against Wood Cormac's habitual occupation in the evening, steady and rhythmic. I heard her, he said finally. I have not decided what it means. Let her show you, Levi said. Stop deciding before she has a chance to. Clara stood at the pump in the dark with her empty bucket in her hand, and the cold eating through her coat and the mountains invisible overhead present, but not seen. She stood there for a long moment. Then she filled the bucket and walked back to the house. She set the bucket in the kitchen and went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and thought about what she had heard. She thought about Millie's hands pressed against her neck on the platform. She thought about Henry working beside her in the cold garden without being asked. She thought about Della standing at the stove directing the porridge with the composure of a general and the grief of a child, and both of those things being true at the same time. She thought the difference between being the 6th woman who leaves and being the woman who stays is not certainty, because she does not have certainty. It is decision. It is deciding before the certainty arrives that you will be someone the certainty can find. She wrote one sentence in her journal that night. They are afraid I will go. I will have to make sure they learn to be afraid of something else. Then she closed the journal and went to sleep. The 3rd week brought 2 things that happened within the same afternoon. The first was Della. Clara had gone to the chicken coop to collect the eggs, which was one of a dozen small tasks that had accumulated into her morning without anyone having formally assigned them. And she found Della already there, struggling with a latch on one of the nesting boxes that had worked loose from its housing. The girl's hands were too small for the tool she was using, and her angle was wrong, and she had been at it long enough that her jaw was set with the particular stubbornness of someone who refuses to ask for help on principle. "I can hold the frame steady while you work the latch," Clara offered. "I do not need help." "I know, but I could hold the frame." Della applied the tool again, missed the fastening, and hit her knuckle against the wood instead. She drew a sharp breath and did not cry. The discipline of that, the sheer daily work of being 8 years old and not having the luxury of showing what hurt struck Clara somewhere low and specific. She crouched down to the girl's level. "Your mother taught you to take care of things," she said. "Not a question." Della went very still. "Do not talk about my mother." "She taught you well," Clara said, and did not stop. "You are capable and strong, and you do everything that needs doing. I have watched you do it. I have been watching since I arrived." Della said nothing, but her shoulders, which had been drawn up around her ears, dropped by a fraction. "I also think," Clara said quietly, "that you are tired." The silence after that was the kind that has something alive in it. "I am the oldest," Della said finally. Her voice was careful. "It is my job." "What if it did not have to be only your job?" "Everyone leaves," Della said. The three words were not an accusation. They were a statement of observed fact delivered by a mind that had been doing its best to make sense of an unreasonable series of events. "If I stop doing it and then you leave, there will be nobody." Clara looked at her for a long moment. "Then let us make an agreement," she said. "You teach me how Henry likes his eggs. I show you how to fix this latch so it stays fixed. We do those two things today and we decide about everything else as we go." Della looked at the latch. She looked at Clara. "Scrambled," she said. "Not wet. He will leave them if they are wet." "Not wet. Good. Now show me where the issue is with this housing and we will fix it together." They fixed it together. When they were done, Della stood and looked at the mended latch and then looked at Clara with an expression that was still guarded but had something in it that had not been there before, a small cautious opening, the way a window opens when you have not been sure the mechanism still works. She did not smile, but she also did not leave. The second thing that happened that afternoon was Raymond Holt. They were in the wagon on the way back from church, all six of them, the first Sunday Clara had attended with the family. She had felt the congregation's attention the way you feel, whether not unkindly in most cases, but comprehensively the way a small community absorbs and processes new information about its own composition. Holt had been sitting in the front pew in a suit that cost more than anything else in the room. He was perhaps 55 years old with the solid, settled look of a man who had made his arrangements long ago and saw no reason to revisit them. He had smiled at Clara when their eyes met briefly, and with no warmth behind it, the smile of a man cataloging rather than greeting. After the service, he had found Elias in the churchyard with the ease of someone who had planned the encounter in advance. "Calloway." He had put his hand on Elias's arm in the manner of a man accustomed to touching things he considers his own. "I want to speak again about the North Valley parcel." "Nothing has changed on that subject, Holt." "Circumstances change. A man managing a property of this size alone with three young children in the approach to winter." Holt's eyes had moved to Clara with the particular quality of a glance that intends to evaluate without appearing to. "And now additional household arrangements to consider." "We are not alone," Elias said. His voice had the quality of bedrock. "Of course." Holt had smiled again, the same cataloging expression. "Still, the offer stands. It is a generous offer. It would simplify things considerably." "Good day, Holt." On the wagon home, when the children were engaged in their own conversation, Levi leaned toward Clara and said in a voice calibrated for her alone, "Raymond Holt has been trying to buy the North Valley parcel since before Marin died. She refused him herself. He came back 3 times after she was gone with better offers each time. Elias turned him away each time. Why does he want it specifically? Because the creek that feeds this valley runs through that parcel. Whoever controls that parcel controls the water. And whoever controls the water, he said simply, controls everything downstream." Clara looked back at the road behind them, where the churchyard was already out of sight behind the tree line. He will not stop asking, she said. No, Levi agreed. He is waiting for us to be tired enough to sell. She thought about this for the rest of the ride home, and then she thought about it while she made Sunday dinner, and then she set it aside because there were dishes to wash and Millie's hair to braid. And Henry had found a bird with a broken wing in the yard and required assistance in constructing a temporary arrangement for its shelter, which took the better part of an hour in the application of more creative problem solving than the situation technically demanded. But she did not forget it. The evening Elias went to the grave was the fourth week. It was Clara who suggested it, though she had been turning the words over for several days looking for the ones that would not cause more damage than they addressed. She found him in the barn, after supper, doing work that did not need doing. He had the look of a man who had been in conversation with himself for so long that the conversation had stopped being productive and become instead a kind of low-grinding punishment. The children want to visit Marin's grave, she said from the doorway. Della has asked me twice. I did not think it was mine to answer. Elias kept his hands moving on the harness. It has been 5 months, she said. Not as an accusation, as a measurement. I know how long it has been. They need to hear you say her name, not to me, to them. They need to know it is allowed, that she is allowed. She paused. Henry asked me last week if his mother had liked onions. He could not remember, and the question broke something in me, and I am standing here asking you to give him the chance to ask it to the right person. The barn was very quiet. One of the draft horses shifted. The lantern made its steady circle of orange light. Elias set down the harness. The following afternoon was clear and cold with the wind off the north face gentled somewhat by the angle of the valley, and the 6 of them walked together to the rise above the south slope where the violet grew in spring and where a simple stone marker faced east to catch the morning light. Clara and Cormac and Levi stopped at the base of the rise. She watched from a distance that was close enough to see and far enough to be absent. She watched Elias kneel between his children with the awkwardness of a large man in a small space. She watched Della uncross her arms and let them fall to her sides. She watched Henry put his hand flat on the ground beside the marker, feeling for something, some quality of presence in the cold earth. She watched Millie crouch down and pick the last of the autumn's dried stalks from around the stone and lay them across it with the solemn ceremony of a small person doing the most important thing she knows how to do. And she watched Elias Calloway, who had not cried in 5 months because he had not known how to start and had been afraid of what would happen if he did lower his head and put one large hand over his face and let the mountain hear what he had been carrying. Cormac turned away, not in embarrassment, in the privacy of a man who knows when not to witness. Levi stood where he was looking at the middle distance, his jaw working. Clara looked at her hands. When they came back down the rise, Della walked ahead of her father and then stopped and turned back and put both arms around his waist and held on. And Elias Calloway put his hand on the back of his daughter's head and held on in return. That evening he sat with the children before bed and said, "Your mother used to sing you a song about the stars. Do you remember it?" And Della, whose voice was clear and true, in the way of children who have not yet been told to be careful with beautiful things, began to sing it. Cormac was passing the doorway when it started. He stopped walking and stood there for a moment with his hand on the doorframe, looking in at the lamplight and the children and his brother's bowed head, and the expression on his face was not one that Clara had seen on him before. It was the expression of someone encountering something they had given up expecting. He looked up and found Clara watching him from across the hallway. Neither of them spoke. He took his hand from the doorframe and walked to the kitchen and put the kettle on, and Clara followed and got down the cups, and they made the tea in the silence of 2 people who have understood something together without needing to name it. She was at the garden gate the morning she heard what Cormac had been carrying. It was still the 4th week. The hard frost had come overnight and locked the ground, and the morning air had the crystalline quality of cold that has committed itself. She was assessing what could still be salvaged before the deep freeze arrived, and she heard his step on the path behind her, heavier than Levi's, more deliberate than Elias's. He stood beside her and looked at the garden. You are still trying to save the root vegetables, he said. Some of them can be celered if I turn them now. He was quiet for a moment. Then he crouched down and began to work the soil with his hands. She did not comment on this. She simply made room and worked beside him. They were halfway through the row when he said without looking up, I was in the house when Marin died. Clara's hands stilled for a moment. Then she continued working. Elias was on the high pasture. He had gone up at first light to check the early calves. Marin had said the night before that everything was fine, that she was fine. He kept his hands moving. She was not fine. But she said she was, and I believed her because it was easier to believe her because going for the doctor would have taken half a day, and she had said she was fine. The wind moved through the bare branches of the kitchen garden fence line. I was in the house, he said again, and I did not go for the doctor until it was already past the point where the doctor could do anything beyond what I could not. And you brought the baby out, Clara said. Yes. And you went to meet Elias on the road. Yes. And you have been carrying what you could have done differently every day since then. He did not answer. But the answer was in the quality of his silence, which was the silence of someone who has been asked a question they have been living inside for so long that hearing it spoken aloud produces something close to vertigo. Cormac, she said. She waited until he looked at her. You did not fail her. The failure is in the assumption that you could have known. You believed what she told you because you trusted her. That is not a failure of duty. That is what it looks like to love someone and take them at their word. He held her gaze for a moment. His expression did not change dramatically. He was not a man given to dramatic expression, but something in it adjusted the way a scale adjusts when a weight has been moved from one side. I decided I needed to keep everyone from getting attached to people who might leave, he said, because if they got attached and then someone left, I would have failed to prevent one more thing. I know, she said. I heard you say as much in the barn. He looked at her. You heard. I was getting water. I was not trying to listen. He processed this without visible distress. Then and yet you stayed. I told Della I would, and I do not make promises I intend to break. She turned back to the garden. Also, you are not entirely wrong that Millie is attached. She is, but the answer to that is not removing me. The answer is giving her a world in which people who love her stay. The silence after that was longer and had a different texture from the ones that had come before it. She could feel him thinking the slow and thorough way he thought, not rushing toward a conclusion, but letting it arrive on its own schedule. You are stubborn, he said finally. I have been told. It is not entirely a criticism. She looked at him. He was not quite smiling, but the edges of the expression were present, suggested rather than stated in the manner of a man who does not spend his smiles carelessly. She returned to the carrots. The following morning, when she came to the kitchen at 4 o'clock, there was firewood beside the stove that had not been there the night before. Not just the usual stack by the door. The full winter's worth of kindling, split and stacked and placed in the covered area off the kitchen porch, where the cold could not get at the moisture of it, arranged with a precision that suggested the work had taken a good part of the night. There was no note. There would never be a note. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the kindling and understood. She understood that Cormac Calloway had been carrying something heavy in a room that had been locked from the inside, and that he had opened the door not all the way and not without difficulty, but open was open, and open was enough to let the air move through. In the kitchen, the morning began its ordinary business. The fire caught, the kettle filled, the house breathed in the slow, warming way of a house that is beginning to remember what it is for. And somewhere above them on the south slope, the last wild violet of the season held on in the cold ground, deciding as it did every winter to come back. The Sunday morning that Judge Arthur Finch came to Bear Creek Valley, the sky was the color of pewter, and the first real snow of the season was threatening from the north in the way of things that have been patient long enough and are done waiting. Clara saw the wagon from the kitchen window while she was making biscuits. She recognized Sheriff Cole Drummond's gray horse first, because she had seen it tied outside the church 3 Sundays running and had noticed, as she noticed most things, the particular way the animal stood when its rider was conducting official business with its head slightly lowered and its weight distributed with a stillness that was different from ordinary waiting. Behind Drummond's horse came a second wagon, and the man on the seat of that wagon wore a dark suit that had no place in this valley, except on occasions when the law had arrived to make itself felt. She stood at the window for a moment, her hands dusted with flour, the biscuits already in the oven and not yet done. Then she wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door. Elias was already on the porch. He had heard the wagon on the road before she had seen it because he had the particular hearing of a man who has spent years listening to a landscape for changes in its patterns. He stood with his arms at his sides and his face set in the way of someone who is prepared to receive whatever is coming and does not intend to be moved by it. Cormac came around the side of the house from the barn. Levi appeared at the porch rail from the direction of the south pasture. The three of them arranged themselves without discussion in the manner of men who have been a unit long enough that their instincts coordinate without requiring instruction. Judge Arthur Finch descended from the wagon with the careful, deliberate movement of a man who understands that his entrances carry meaning and conducts himself accordingly. He was perhaps 60 years old, lean and upright, with gray hair cropped close and eyes that moved over the property with the impersonal efficiency of an instrument calibrated for assessment rather than appreciation. Sheriff Drummond hung back a half step, which was not Clara noticed the position of a man who agreed with what he had been asked to accompany. "Mr. Calloway," the judge said, "I represent the Carroll County Circuit. We have received a formal complaint regarding the welfare and moral environment of the children residing at this property." Elias said nothing. He waited. The complaint alleges that an unmarried woman of questionable character is residing in this household in an arrangement that violates the standards of decency required by county ordinance when children are present. We are here to assess the situation and determine whether the children's placement requires adjustment. The word adjustment landed in the cold air and stayed there. "Adjustment," Elias said. He said it the way he said most things quietly, but the quietness had an edge in it that Clara had not heard before. If the living situation is found to be unsuitable, the children would be remanded temporarily to the care of the county. The Carroll County Children's Welfare Home in Mill Haven accepts placements during investigation periods. Cormac took one step forward. Levi's hand came to his arm. "You are speaking," Elias said with a control that Clara could see was costing him, "about taking 3 children who have already lost their mother from the only home they have ever known during winter on the basis of a complaint filed by someone who has not set foot on this property. We are speaking about a legal obligation to ensure their welfare." Finch's voice carried no particular heat. He was not a cruel man, Clara thought. He was a precise one, which was in some ways more difficult to argue with. "I will need to speak with the children individually. I will need to inspect the premises. And I will need the relevant parties to present themselves at a community hearing no later than Thursday, at which point a determination will be made." He looked at Clara for the first time. "I assume you are Miss Whitfield." "I am." "You are advised that the complaint includes specific reference to your history. A prior engagement in Kansas in 1872, terminated at the discretion of the other party due to concerns about your suitability." He said it as though reading from a document which he probably was in his memory if not on paper. "This will be entered into the record of the hearing." The wind came off the mountain and moved through the yard and went on. Clara looked at him steadily. "I understand," she said. She did not say anything on. She turned and went inside to where the children were, because whatever came next, they should not hear it from the yard. He interviewed them one at a time in the front room. Clara sat in the kitchen and listened to the quality of the silences between the questions, because she could not hear the questions themselves, only the shape of them in the way the children's voices responded. Della's voice first steady and then wavering. Henry's voice smaller, uncertain. And then Millie's voice, which did not waver because Millie was 3 years old, and 3-year-olds respond to cold tones the way animals respond to weather, not by adjusting their presentation, but by reaching for the nearest thing that feels safe. Millie reached for Clara through the doorway. She was crying in the particular way of small children who do not understand what is happening, but understand completely that something is wrong. And the sound of it was the kind of sound that organized itself inside Clara's chest and became something she would carry for a long time. She could not go to her, not while the judge was conducting his assessment. She stood in the kitchen doorway with her hands pressed together and watched Millie cry for her and could not do the one thing in the world she wanted to do. Elias stood in the hall with his fists at his sides and his jaw set like a man deciding whether a thing is worth the consequences. It was Levi who caught his eye and shook his head slightly once. Elias stood where he was. The judge inspected the premises afterward with the thoroughness of a man who has decided in advance that thoroughness is his own form of fairness. He noted the children's rooms. He noted the separate lock on Clara's door. He noted the clean kitchen and the filled larder and the condition of the house, which was not immaculate, but was unmistakably inhabited by people who were trying. He wrote things in a small notebook. Then he said, "The children are physically well cared for. The complaint regarding the moral arrangement stands. Miss Whitfield has 72 hours to vacate the premises. If she remains beyond that period, I will return with authority to remove the children to county care pending a full investigation." He mounted his wagon. He drove away. The yard was very quiet. Della, who had come out onto the porch during the last exchange, said nothing. She was looking at the road where the wagon had gone with an expression that Clara recognized because she had worn a version of it herself on a train platform in Abilene in 1872, the expression of someone watching a thing they feared happen exactly as they feared it would happen. Clara went inside. She did not go to her room. She went to the kitchen and stood at the window and looked at the south slope where the violet would come back in spring. And she thought with the kind of clarity that sometimes comes when things become simple because the complicated options have been removed. She thought about Millie crying for her from the doorway and about not being able to cross that distance of 12 feet. She thought about Cormac's kindling stacked in the dark before dawn and Elias's voice saying Marin like it cost something he could not spare, and Henry in the garden asking about the things that rest all winter so they can grow in spring. Then she thought about something she had not allowed herself to think about until now. She went to find Elias. She found him in the barn again. She was beginning to understand that the barn was his thinking place, the way the garden was hers, the way the wood and the knife were Cormac's. People carried their thinking to different places, and the knowing of where someone went when they needed to be alone with their own mind was a form of intimacy she had not anticipated learning so quickly. He heard her come in and did not turn around. "I am going to leave," she said. Now he turned. "If I go," she said before he could speak, "the judge has no grounds for the complaint. The children stay where they are. Whatever Holt intended by filing that complaint, he does not get what he actually wanted, which is the chain of events that ends with you selling the North Valley parcel because you are exhausted and without help. And you go where," Elias said. "That is not the part that needs resolving tonight. It is the part I am asking about." She looked at him. "I will find something," she said. "I always have." "That is not an answer." "Elias, it is not." He crossed the barn and stood in front of her, and the height of him and the set of his face in the lantern light had the quality of a man who has been careful for a long time and has run out of the particular resource that carefulness requires. "If you leave because a judge with a complaint filed by Raymond Holt's money tells you that you are unsuitable for this house, then the world is run by Raymond Holt and men like him, and I will not accept that." "Your children cannot go to Millhaven," she said quietly. "No, they cannot." He held her gaze. "Which is why we are going to find another way." "There may not be one." "Then we make one." He paused. The lantern moved slightly in the draft from the barn door. "I am not good at this," he said, "at saying what is true about what I feel." Marin knew that, and she was patient with it because she understood that the saying was not the same as the having. Clara waited. "I am telling you," he said, "that this is not only about the children anymore. It has not been only about the children for some time, and I will not pretend otherwise to make an easier argument. The barn was very quiet. Elias, she said. I know it is too soon, he said. I know there is grief in the way of it and complications that would require a kind of patience that I cannot guarantee. I am not asking you to resolve anything. I am asking you not to resolve it by leaving. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about a platform in Kansas and a man who had turned his back. She thought about 2 years of being sufficient. She thought about $14 in a boot and a notice on a church board that had said not for the faint of heart. And she thought about the fact that she was still here, which was its own kind of answer to the question of whether she was. Then we fight it, she said. She watched something in his face which had been set hard for a long time come slightly open. Only slightly. He was not a man for whom things came open easily or all at once, but slightly was enough. Yes, he said. We fight it. They walked back to the house together. It was Clara who organized the response. She sat at the kitchen table that night with Elias and Cormac and Levi after the children were in bed, and she laid out what she had been thinking since the judge's wagon had gone down the road. We need 3 things, she said. She had a piece of paper in front of her, written in her careful hand, while everyone else was settling the children. We need a witness who can speak to the children's condition. Someone withstanding the court will recognize. Dorothy Crane at the school has seen Della every week since September. She can speak to what Della was when the school year began and what Della is now. Dorothy will do it, Levi said. She told me last Tuesday that Della had turned in her first complete assignment in 6 weeks. She was pleased enough about it that she stopped me in the street to say so. Good. Second, we need the complaint against me addressed at its source. The judge read from information about Abilene and Harold Price. Someone researched that specifically. That is not general knowledge. Someone paid for it. Cormac, who had been sitting with his knife in a piece of wood but not working, either of them looked up. Holt, he said. It had to be. Who else would benefit from it? She looked at Levi. You said you knew someone Holt had used in the past for certain arrangements. Silas Rourke, Levi said. He runs errands for Holt when Holt wants things done at a remove. I know where to find him. If Rourke can be persuaded to confirm what Holt asked him to do, that changes the character of the complaint entirely. It becomes a property dispute dressed as a moral concern. The judge is a precise man. He does not strike me as one who would appreciate being used as an instrument in a land grab. Cormac set down his knife. I can speak to Rourke, he said. Can you persuade him? I can make the alternative clear, Cormac said. The tone in which he said it was not threatening. It was simply accurate in the way of men who do not say things they do not mean. Third, Clara said. She paused. This was the one she was least certain of, the one that required a kind of faith that experience had not particularly encouraged. I want to go to Margaret Holt. The 3 brothers looked at her. She told me I was unsuitable, Clara said. She told me a man would not choose a woman who had already decided she was not worth choosing. She said it with the plainness of someone who believed it to be true and thought she was doing me a service by saying it. If she has changed her assessment, and I think she may have because she is a fair woman, even if she is not always a kind one, her voice at a public hearing carries a weight that the voice of a friend cannot. A person who was once against you and has changed their mind is a different order of witness entirely. Silence. Then Elias said, You want to go to the woman who told you that you were not worth choosing and ask her to say publicly that she was wrong. Yes. Why do you think she will? Because Clara said that she is 60 years old and she has been fair her whole life. And she is the kind of person who, when shown clearly that she was wrong, would rather say so honestly than carry the wrongness quietly. She paused. And because she watched Millie hold on to me on that platform, and I think it changed something in her, even if she has not said so yet. Elias looked at her for a long time. All right, he said. Levi found Silas Rourke on the Tuesday before the hearing at the feed store in Millhaven, where Rourke conducted the minor portions of his business that were not worth concealing. What passed between them in the back of the feed store was not witnessed and was not recorded and was never discussed in detail afterward. But Rourke arrived at Clara's door the following morning with a written statement that he left on the porch without knocking, and the statement confirmed that he had been paid by Raymond Holt to obtain and provide information about Clara Whitfield's history in Kansas, and that the same payment had covered his delivery of certain material to a third party who had subsequently filed the formal complaint with the county circuit. Sheriff Drummond read the statement that afternoon in his office with Clara and Levi present, and then set it on his desk and looked at it for a moment before saying quietly and with the specific expression of a man who had suspected as much, but had required evidence before he could act on the suspicion, "I will be at the hearing on Thursday." The community gathered at the Baptist church on Thursday morning with the mixture of motivations that small communities always bring to public proceedings, some arriving out of genuine concern, some out of the particular fascination that attaches to spectacle, when spectacle is rare, and some simply because a Thursday with nowhere to be is a Thursday that benefits from direction. The church was full. Judge Finch sat at the front with the careful posture of a man who intends the proceedings to be orderly. Raymond Holt sat in the third pew in his expensive suit, and the suit was doing less work than usual because the man wearing it had been informed the previous evening by Sheriff Drummond of the existence of Silas Rourke's statement, and the information had done something to his face that the suit could not entirely conceal. Clara sat with the Calloway family in the second row, Elias on her left, Millie in her lap, Henry beside Elias, his shoulder pressed against his father's arm. Della on the aisle, her braid done correctly that morning for the first time in weeks because Clara had helped and because Della had let her. Cormac and Levi sat directly behind them. Judge Finch opened the proceedings. He read the complaint. He summarized the legal obligations. He stated the purpose of the hearing with the practiced precision of a man who has performed this function many times and respects it too much to perform it carelessly. Then he asked whether anyone wished to speak. Elias stood. He was not a man given to public speech. He was not the kind of man who found the gathering of many people into one room in the expectation of articulation to be natural or comfortable. But he stood up and he turned to face the congregation, and he spoke with the directness of a man who has decided that the truth is the only available tool, and he intends to use it properly. "My wife died in May," he said. "In the months since my children have been cared for by 5 different women, none of whom stayed. I watched my daughter stop sleeping. I watched my son stop talking. I watched my youngest child hold onto my leg because she was afraid of losing something else." He paused. "Then Clara Whitfield came, and my daughter slept, and my son asked me questions about the sky again." And Millie laughed. He looked at the judge directly. "I do not know what standard of decency is being applied here, but I know what I have watched happen in my house, and I know what I watched not happen for 5 months before she arrived. If that is an immoral arrangement, I would like someone to explain to me what a moral one looks like." He sat down. Dorothy Crane stood. She was a small, precise woman who had the natural authority of someone who has spent 20 years managing the undivided attention of children, which is a skill that transfers cleanly to adult audiences. She spoke about Della. She spoke about the assignment turned in with a note at the bottom. She quoted the note exactly because she had kept it. The room was quiet in the way that a room is quiet when something true has been said in it. Then Margaret Holt stood up. She was 61 years old, and she stood the way she had always stood, straight and without apology, the way of a woman who has conducted herself according to her own strict code for so long that the code and the woman have become the same thing. "I told Clara Whitfield," she said in a voice that carried clearly to every part of the room, "that she was not the kind of woman a man would choose. I told her she had made herself too small to be seen. I told her that at her age, with her circumstances, she ought to have found her footing." She paused. "I said all of that, and I believed I was being fair, and I was wrong." The room stayed quiet. "I have spent 60 years on this earth watching people," she said. "I have seen what love looks like when it is real, and what it looks like when it is convenient. When I watched that child on the platform walk to Clara Whitfield and hold up her arms and watch Clara Whitfield hold her without hesitating, I saw something I have not seen often enough in my life to mistake for something else. She looked at the judge. The person who is unsuitable in this room is not standing in the second pew. The congregation began slowly to make itself heard. Not all of them. The room was not a unanimous place and had never pretended to be. But enough voices, enough visible turning toward one conclusion rather than another, that the quality of the hearing had shifted in the way of things that have been weighed and found to have come down on a particular side. Sheriff Drummond stood. He did not raise his voice. He simply laid out with the flat, unapologetic delivery of a man who has facts and considers them sufficient what Silas Rourke's statement contained and what it implied about the origins of the complaint and the motives behind it. Raymond Holt sat in the third pew and looked at the back of the pew in front of him. Judge Finch wrote in his notebook for a long time. Then he closed the notebook and looked at the room. The complaint is withdrawn on the basis of demonstrated improper origin, he said. The children are confirmed in their current placement, which I find to be suitable in all relevant respects. He looked at Clara. He looked at Elias. However, the county record will note that the arrangement requires formalization. If Miss Whitfield remains in residence, the household structure must be made regular under the law. The minister of the Baptist Church, Reverend Samuel Wick, was sitting in the fourth pew because he attended every public gathering in his church as a matter of principle. He stood up now with the serene practicality of a man who has married people in more unusual circumstances than this and found the institution no worse for it. If there is willingness on both sides, he said, I can perform the ceremony today. He said it the way you say something obvious. The church went very still. Elias turned to Clara. She would think about this moment later often, and in particular, she would think about what he did not do. He did not look at the room. He did not consider the audience or the occasion or the weight of precedent or the complication of timing. He looked at her the way he had looked at things that mattered since she had known him directly and without decoration, and he said what he had to say. I know this is not how it should be, he said. I know there ought to be more time and better circumstances and a proper question asked in a proper place without a courtroom full of neighbors watching. He stopped. But Clara, you came to this valley with $14 in a carpet bag, and you told me you would not leave, and I have watched you keep that promise every day since. I am not asking you because the judge requires it. I am asking you because everything in me that still knows how to want something wants this. She looked at him. She thought about the notice on the church board in Helena and the $11 spent on a ticket in the mountain road in the dark in Millie's hands. She thought about the biscuits in the oven that morning when the judge arrived, taken out late and still warm when the hearing was done. She thought about Violet on a windowsill and kindling before dawn and Henry in the garden, understanding something true about resting and growing. She thought about Harold Price on a platform in Abilene, who had said she was not suitable. She thought I was not suitable for him. I have never been more certain of anything. Yes, she said. Cormac, sitting directly behind her, exhaled. It was a small sound. Nobody else would have heard it. She heard it. Levi made no small sound. But when she turned after accepting, he was smiling in the wide, uncomplicated way she had come to understand was his honest face, the face underneath the warmth. And it was the most unguarded expression she had seen on a Callaway man since she had arrived. The ceremony took 11 minutes. When it was done, Della came through the pew ahead of everyone else and wrapped her arms around Clara's waist and held on with the focused total grip of a child who has decided something and is not inclined to revisit the decision. Henry stood beside his father and looked at Clara with a serious face and said in the measured way he said things he had thought carefully about, now you are ours. Millie, who had been in Levi's arms throughout the ceremony and had watched with the complete unblinking attention of someone absorbing something important, said simply, Mama. It was the first time she said it that clearly, that cleanly, as a statement rather than a reaching. Clara put her hand on the small girl's cheek. She could not speak for a moment. That was all right. Some things did not require speaking. Behind her, Cormac moved past and paused. He did not make a speech. He was not built for speeches any more than Elias was. But he put one hand briefly on her shoulder as he passed, the same brief, certain gesture he used with his brothers when something mattered, and then he walked out of the church into the cold, bright morning and began unhitching the wagon for the ride home. Raymond Holt left before the ceremony finished and did not return that week or the next. And in the spring, he sold his property to a family from Nebraska and left the valley for good. Nobody marked his departure with particular ceremony. The first winter passed. It passed the way hard things pass when you are not alone in them, not quickly and not without bomb, but with the particular shape of something that is being endured rather than survived, which is a different thing entirely because enduring implies that there is something on the other side worth reaching. There were days of cold, so deep the windows were opaque with frost by mid-morning, and the stock had to be brought into the lower barn, and the children could not go out for 3 days running. There were nights when Millie woke crying, and Clara went to her and stayed until the small body quieted, sometimes an hour once until nearly dawn, sitting in the rocking chair beside the small bed with one hand on the blanket and the stars going slowly over the black window above them. There was an evening in January when the pipes in the north wall froze, and the work of dealing with it took half the night and all 4 adults, and by the time it was resolved they were cold enough and tired enough that the kitchen felt like safety itself, the lamp on the table and the stove going, and the coffee Elias made without being asked steaming in the cups. There was the night Cormac finished whatever he had been carving since before Clara arrived. He set it on the kitchen table without comment one evening after supper. It was a box made from mountain pine with a lid that fitted exactly. The top was carved with violet, the small, precise kind that grew on the south slope in spring. Around the sides were 4 small panels. One held a bird in flight, one held an open book, one held a set of small handprints, a child's pressed into the wood as a pattern. The 4th was carved with the Bear Creek Mountains, the specific shape of the ridge above the valley, recognizable to anyone who had stood on the porch and looked north. Inside the lid, cut into the wood in the careful, deliberate letters of a man who had taught himself to read late and valued written words for that reason, was a name: Clara Calloway. She stood at the table and looked at it for a long time. Cormac sat across from her with his coffee and said nothing in the way of a man who has said the thing and does not see the need to explain it. She closed the box carefully. Then she looked up at him. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. That was all. Spring came to Bear Creek Valley the way spring always came to mountain country, which was gradually and then all at once the snow retreating up the slopes, the creek rising with the melt, the aspens budding in the pale, uncertain green that suggested rather than declared that winter was finished. The garden had to be turned and planted again. Henry was beside her for every inch of it. They planted the onions first because it had been the last thing they had discussed before the world became complicated, and it seemed right to return to it as a starting point. Henry was 6 years old in April and had his father's manner of approaching work, which was with full attention and without waste of motion. "Mama Clara," he said, crouching over the row with a small trowel. It was the first time he had said it, and he did not appear to notice the significance which made it more significant rather than less. "Yes. Do you think the violet will be early this year?" "I think it will be exactly on time," she said. "It always is." He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Levi says that things in the mountains run on their own schedule." "Levi is right about that." "He is right about most things," Henry said in the tone of a 6-year-old who has assembled this conclusion from evidence rather than received it as received wisdom. "Except the way to fix the north fence. He is wrong about that." "What does Cormac say about the north fence?" "He says the same thing Levi says, but quieter, so it sounds more right." Clara laughed, which was still something she did with the slightly surprised quality of a person rediscovering a thing they had forgotten was still available to them. Henry looked up at the sound of it and smiled his small, serious smile. They planted the onions in the cold spring soil, and covered them and let them be. And by June, they came up green and deliberate and sure of themselves, which was what things did when you gave them enough time and enough trust to find their way. 2 years after the hearing, Levi brought home a woman named Constance Aldridge from a town 3 valleys over where he had gone to buy a bull and had apparently found something more interesting than he expected. He introduced her at Sunday dinner with the careful, slightly self-conscious air of a man who is prepared to defend a decision he feels good about, but has not yet had confirmed from the outside. Constance was 26 years old with red-brown hair and an expression of comprehensive competence that suggested she had assessed the Calloway household from the road and found it acceptable, which was itself a quality Clara respected. Clara shook her hand and said, "How did you come here from town?" "By wagon," Constance said. "The road is better than I expected." "It is better in spring than in winter." Levi mentioned that. "Did he mention everything?" "He mentioned enough," Constance said with a directness that Clara immediately recognized as belonging to a woman who had learned early that plain speaking was more efficient than its alternatives. She liked her considerably. The following spring, Levi and Constance were married in the same Baptist church by the same Reverend Wick, and the gathering afterward at the ranch house was the first occasion since before Marin's death that the place had held that many people that comfortably, and somewhere in the middle of it, Clara stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the room full of people who had become in the way that happens gradually, and then all at once, her people. The years went by with the honest weight of lived time, not quickly and not slowly, but in the rhythm of a life that is full enough not to go unnoticed and meaningful enough to go by faster than expected. Della grew up with the competence she had always had and added to it gradually the willingness to be helped. She left for the Valley School at 14 and came back at 17 with enough knowledge to teach the Bear Creek School herself, which she did, and with the same braids she had always worn, done exactly as her mother had done them, which she could do now without help because Clara had learned the pattern and taught it back to her and then let her own it entirely. Henry was at 15 nearly as tall as Elias, and he had Elias's way with the land and Cormac's way of sitting with a thing until he understood it, and Levi's way of laughing when something was genuinely funny without apologizing for it. He was going to be formidable, Clara thought, watching him in the field one autumn afternoon in exactly the ways that formidable men are worth the space they take up. Millie grew up knowing she had been loved from the very beginning, which is not a thing every child can say, and it showed in the way she moved through the world, which was with the ease of someone who has never had to prove their place in it. She had her mother's eyes, Elias said once, looking at her across the dinner table, not as a sadness, as a gratitude. There was a summer afternoon in the 10th year when the family gathered for a barn raising for a neighbor 3 miles down the valley, and Clara stood at the edge of the gathering with Constance beside her and watched the extended architecture of what had been built, not the barn, but the family, the children running between the adults, the 3 brothers working in the synchronized way of men who have been a unit so long that the unit moves like a single organism. And she thought about a church board in Helena and $11 and the conviction that there was nothing faint about her heart. That evening, walking back to the ranch house in the long mountain dusk, Elias fell into step beside her in the way he always did, not making a ceremony of it, but simply being where she was, which she had come to understand was his fundamental expression of a thing he had never been particularly able to say in words and had never needed to. "Tired," he said. "Pleasantly," she said. He put his hand on her back, brief and certain in the way he had for 10 years, and they walked the rest of the way in the comfortable silence of people who have long since run out of things they need to prove to one another. In the autumn of 1899, 25 years after a young woman with $14 in her boot had stepped off a train at Bear Creek Station and kept a promise she was not certain she was capable of keeping, Clara Whitfield Calloway stood on the porch of the house she had helped to build and looked out at the valley below. The aspens had turned again. They were always turning or returning again, the cycle of them so reliable that it had stopped being remarkable and become instead the backdrop against which everything else was remarkable. The children who were now grown, the grandchildren who ran between the yellow floored meadows below the creek, that was still running the mountains that were still standing. Elias came out from the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee. He was 59 years old. His hair was mostly gray, and he was slower in the mornings than he had been, and his hands, which had always been large and calloused, were thicker now at the knuckles in the way of hands that have done decades of work and carry the record of it honestly. He set 1 cup on the rail in front of her without asking whether she wanted it. He'd been doing that for 25 years. She wrapped both hands around the cup as she had in a kitchen she remembered clearly on a night when they had both been something other than what they became. "Do you remember the first morning?" she asked. "Which one?" "The first morning at the ranch, before anyone else was up." He was quiet for a moment in the way of someone finding a specific thing in a large collection of things. "You had the biscuits started." "I had not yet finished them," she said. "The judge arrived before they came out of the oven. They came out fine. They came out late. Everything that matters comes out late." He looked at the valley. "Or that is what you told Henry about the garden that first spring. Something about resting long enough to know what you are before you grow." She looked at him. "You were listening." "I am always listening." He said it simply without performance. "I am not always talking. That is not the same thing." Below them on the south slope, the last of the autumn's violet was still holding in the cold the small purple flowers that came back every year without being asked, that knew the valley well enough not to need encouragement, that had learned across all the years of being planted and cut and weathered and returned that this was where they belonged. Cormac and Levi were sitting in the chairs at the far end of the porch, older and grayer, and still conducting the same ongoing disagreement about the right way to maintain the north fence, which had become at some point less about the fence than about the pleasure of the argument itself, and their voices carried in the clear autumn air, with the comfortable familiarity of a sound that has been part of the background of a place for so long that the place would feel wrong without it. Levi caught her eye across the porch and raised his cup. She raised hers. Cormac did not look up, but the corner of his mouth moved in the way that she had learned years ago to read as his version of the same gesture. Della was inside. She could hear her through the open window, reading to one of the grandchildren in the clear voice she had always had, the voice that had first sung the stars song in a lamplight living room and had never entirely lost the quality of that particular evening. Henry was in the barn with his own son, conducting the same tutorial in the care of animals that Elias had once conducted with him, passing the knowledge forward in the patient, wordless way of things that do not require ceremony to be preserved. Millie came around the side of the house with 2 of her children chasing each other through the fallen leaves at her heels, and she saw Claire on the porch and smiled the wide, unguarded smile of a woman who had grown up knowing she was loved and wore the knowing easily. "Mama," she said, "we are starting supper." "I will be in," Clara said. "In a minute." Millie gathered her children and went inside, and the sounds of the kitchen starting up came through the open windows, water and pots, and the voices of people who knew each other's ways well enough to work together in a small space without difficulty. Clara looked out at the valley one more time. She thought about the woman she had been on a platform in Kansas in the spring of 1872, standing with a carpet bag in one hand and the ruins of something she had tried to build in the other, watching a man walk away from her as though she were a thing he had ordered incorrectly and returned without guilt. She thought about the woman she had been on a platform in Helena in the autumn of 1874 with $14 in her boot and a notice in her coat pocket, and the particular quality of courage that is not the absence of fear, but the decision to go forward anyway, which is the only kind of courage that is ever real. She thought about a small girl walking toward her with her arms raised, certain of something that no one had yet confirmed. She thought Millie knew before I did. She thought children so often do. The mountain held its place on the horizon as it always had, as it would long after everyone on this porch was gone, and something else had come to stand where they were standing and look out at the same valley and feel perhaps the same thing she was feeling now, which was the particular completeness of a life that has been lived in the direction of what matters rather than away from it. She had come to this valley with nothing and been given everything that nothing had prepared her for. She had stayed because she said she would, and in the staying, she had become not what anyone would have chosen for her, not what the world had arranged, not what Harold Price or Margaret Holt or any judge or complaint or winter or grief had suggested she was capable of being. She had become Clara Calloway. She had become, against all the reasonable evidence of her earlier life, exactly where she was supposed to be. Below the porch in the south meadow, the last violet of October held its color against the cold, with the stubborn, unspectacular faithfulness of things that have decided to come back every year and have never once found a reason to stop. The coffee was warm in her hands. The mountain stood where it had always stood. The family was inside beginning supper. She went in.